I saw this cedar stacked with the split firewood when we first moved into this house. I didn't recognize it as cedar until after I salvaged it and started cutting it up into usable dimensions. My box joint jig requires switching out the regular combination blade for a dado stack. I got this dado stack for a pretty good price from a yard sale in our neighborhood last year. While I don't like switching it out, it wasn't really too terrible to do. I set the blade height to be a touch more than the thickness of the material. This box joint jig is a lot better than the first one I made. The prior version was attached to my miter gauge and was way too sloppy. One of the improvements of this version of the jig is having runners in both miter slots. Makes the jig much more stable. To avoid tear out, I'm using a backing board behind the workpiece and moving the backing board along with the workpiece after each cut. When I finished cutting the box joints in the first side of the box, I used that first side to set where the first cut should go on the second and fourth sides, which I cut together. My dry fit was pretty encouraging. I was trying to wrap the grain pattern around the board, so each side had to be in a particular order. I realized, though, that wrapping the grain pattern doesn't matter nearly as much with box joints as it does with miter joints. The dry fit revealed that some of the joints were a bit too tight, so off camera I chiseled away enough material to get a snug fit. My first attempt at a box joint box was not pretty. Because my jig was a bit sloppy, the fingers of the joints were not particularly consistent. Also, there was a fair amount of tear out because I didn't use a backing board. In short, it looks, well, not good. For now, I still keep it in my shop as a reminder of what I've learned from it. I seem to get just about the right amount of glue on these joints, which to me is a win. I feel like I'm usually adding way too much glue and then having a big mess from all the glue squeeze out. Then not only do I have a huge mess to clean up, I also have to console myself after wasting all that Tite Bond. So much money that just gets wiped up and then discarded into the trash. I started the glue up with 2 of the sides, and then glued up the other 2 sides, and then put all 4 sides together. It probably would have been better to instead add the 3rd side to the first 2 sides, and then the 4th side to the other 3. As it was, I was applying a bit more pressure than I wanted to, risking some damage to the joints. Once I had the sides in place, I used the combination square to ensure the box was, well, square. I wasn't worried about the fingers of the joints protruding a little bit, since I knew I was going to be sanding it smooth later anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to make the lid and the bottom of the box, which begins by measuring and then marking where to make the cuts. I had to change the dado stack on the table saw back to the combination blade. I hope you appreciate that I spared you having to see that. That consideration is certainly worthy of you subscribing to the channel, right? With the bottom and lid cut out, I used the router to cut away a profile that was pretty close to the width of the sides. For the lid, I opted to sand away the excess material, but I ended up making the lip of the lid a lot thinner than I intended. I adjusted the router a bit before cutting the bottom so that I had more clearance and didn't have to sand. Unlike the lid, I glued the bottom of the box onto the box. I made a little handle for the lid out of one of the offcuts. I measured so that I could center the handle on the lid and then sanded the handle, going through the grits. I figured the handle was the part of the box most likely to be touched, so it was perhaps the most important part to ensure was sanded smooth. I used the measuring tool to ensure that the handle was placed properly. Unfortunately, I had a bit of tear out on the bottom when I ran it through the router table. I applied some glue to that spot and then found some small pieces that I could jam into it. The repair doesn't look pretty at first, but this is an important step in my woodworking journey, finding ways to fix problems as they come up. I clamped the bottom onto the box to allow the glue to dry and cure. The glue somehow dried moments later, and I removed the clamps. I used a chisel to remove the excess material from the tear out repair that I'd glued onto the bottom. There was so much sanding to do. I'll spare you having to watch it all. That's got to be worth a thumbs up on the video, right? After sanding, I did an inspection inside and out to see if the box was ready for the finish. Speaking of the finish, I just used paste wax. I wasn't expecting this box to be subject to much moisture or abuse, so I figured the wax would be sufficient protection. It's pretty quick and easy to apply, which appealed to my lazy side. I applied the paste wax inside and out with one cloth, and then with a clean, dry cloth, came back to it several minutes later to buff out the wax. I really like the look of the waxed cedar, and especially appreciate not having to smell fumes from lacquer or polyurethane or any other finish. If you look closely at the lid, you can see what I mean about having sanded the lip a bit too much, leaving a lot more of a gap than I was intending. Overall, though, I am pretty pleased with how this box turned out. It's definitely the best box joint box I've made to date.